Beirut in the 1970s was not a city. It was a wound that refused to close. What had once been called the Paris of the Middle East had by the middle of that decade become something else entirely. A labyrinth of militias, foreign intelligence services, and unresolved hatreds layered so deep that even the people who lived there had stopped trying to count them. The Lebanese War had started in 1975. The city had been divided into pieces in a way that no one could understand. Yet within that fracture, certain people moved with extraordinary confidence. One of them was Ali Hassan Salameh. He was 35 years old in 1978, and he carried himself like a man who had already survived everything the world could throw at him. In a sense, he had. Mossad had been trying to kill him for years. They had been after him for decades. In 1973, in an ordinary Norwegian town, they had come dangerously close. But this operation was very different from the operations they had carried out until then. For the first time, Mossad had carried out a disgraceful operation. They had shot the wrong man. They had arrested their own agents. They had turned a covert manhunt into an international scandal. And yet Ali Hassan Salameh was still alive, still moving through Beirut, still by any reasonable measure untouchable. His nickname, the Red Prince, had a certain theatrical quality to it, the kind of name that belongs in fiction rather than history. But the story behind it was real enough. His father, Hassan Salameh, had been a commander in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a man of some local legend who died fighting. Ali inherited the name, the legacy, and eventually the burden of the war. He rose quickly within Fatah, the Palestinian nationalist movement led by Yasser Arafat, and became the head of Force 17, Arafat's close protection unit that followed him like a constant shadow. He was not a man who sat behind desks. He was operational, instinctive, and, according to those who encountered him, genuinely magnetic. He was also, in the eyes of the Israeli government, directly responsible for the massacre at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The shadow of Munich was always there and never disappeared. Not for the families of the people who lost their lives, not for Israel, and not for the Mossad agents who were tasked with preventing something like this from ever happening again. Operation Wrath of God, the name itself carried the weight of ancient fury, had been authorized by Prime Minister Golda Meir. The directive was simple in its intent and staggering in its implications. Find the men responsible for Munich and eliminate them, one by one, wherever they were, no matter how long it took. The names on the list were erased one by one in different cities across Europe, in ordinary apartments, and on quiet streets where the sound of a suppressed gun disappeared into the bustle of daily life. But one name remained stubbornly, maddeningly alive. Ali Hassan Salameh, the Red Prince, the failure in Lillehammer, Norway, in July 1973, is worth pausing on, because it was not merely an operational mistake. It was a moral catastrophe that the Mossad spent years quietly absorbing. A tip had come in saying that Salameh was living under a false identity in a small town and working as a waiter in an old restaurant. A team was urgently assembled. After days of surveillance, on the evening of July 21, 1973, a man named Ahmed Bouchiki was shot and killed while walking home with his pregnant wife after a movie. Ahmed Bouchiki was not Ali Hassan Salameh. He was a Moroccan immigrant, a pool attendant with no connection to Black September or any other militant organization. He was 24 years old. He had done nothing. The fallout was immediate and severe. Norwegian police arrested several Mossad operatives in the days that followed. Abraham Gamer and Sylvia Raphael were among those who were captured. Their story emerged from the operation as one of the quiet and touching stories. They fell in love while in prison. They got married, and their story was etched into memory as a small detail that remained strangely human within an operation remembered as entirely ruthless. The Norwegian government lodged formal protests. The international press had a story it could not put down, and the Mossad, an agency whose entire operational value rested on the perception of near infallibility, had demonstrated something it could not afford to demonstrate: that it could make catastrophic mistakes. Salameh, who had been nowhere near Norway, reportedly heard the news and understood what it meant. The Mossad had been close enough to act, close enough to stake a team on a location, and had still missed. He adjusted his security posture accordingly. He became, if anything, more careful, more deliberate. He moved between safe houses in Beirut with a discipline that frustrated the intelligence agencies tracking him. He kept his circle tight, he varied his routes. He was, those who study this period agree, a sophisticated and self-aware target who understood that someone, somewhere, was still looking. And yet, paradoxically, Ali Hassan Salameh was also living in something very close to the open. This is the detail that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. Salameh was not hiding in the traditional sense of the word. He had a wife. His second wife was a former Miss Universe contestant named Georgina Risk. This woman's beauty was on everyone's lips. The fame of this Lebanese woman gave her husband an almost glamorous and captivating aura in certain places. They attended parties. They moved through the upper social strata of Beirut's surviving elite with a casualness that suggested either profound confidence or a calculation that visibility was itself a form of protection. If the Mossad killed him in a public setting, the political consequences would be severe. If they killed him anywhere, they still had to find him first. There was another complication, one that does not appear in the official narratives, but that has been substantiated by enough sources to be treated as historically credible. Salameh had a relationship with the Central Intelligence Agency, not a formal one, not one that involved signed agreements or official sanction, but a functional, pragmatic arrangement in which Salameh served as a back channel, a man who could guarantee, or at least significantly influence, the safety of American personnel in Lebanon, at a time when Lebanon was becoming increasingly dangerous for Americans to be in. Robert Ames, a senior CIA officer with deep regional expertise, is believed to have been the primary handler of this relationship. Ames understood Beirut, he understood Salameh, and he understood that Salameh's continued existence served a very specific American interest. The CIA communicated this to the Israelis. Not once, but repeatedly. The message, delivered through whatever channels were available in the complex, often fractious relationship between the two intelligence services, was something to the effect of, "Leave this one alone. He was someone important to us. His death would have created serious problems for us." According to some intelligence officers, this intervention was the most important reason Salameh remained alive for so long without being killed. That the Mossad, despite its authorization and its intent, held back in part because the Americans asked them to. This argument is contested. What is not contested is the timeline. Salameh survived throughout the 1970s, was known to be in Beirut, was the subject of ongoing surveillance, and was not killed until January 1979. Whatever the reason for the delay, operational difficulty, CIA pressure, shifting priorities in the aftermath of the 1973 war and the 1975 Civil War. The gap between Munich and Beirut is nearly 7 years. 7 years in which the man Israel held responsible for the deaths of 11 Olympic athletes continued to live, to operate, to marry a beauty queen, and to drink coffee in the cafes of a city that was tearing itself apart around him. The woman who arrived quietly in Beirut would eventually fill that 7-year gap. She arrived without attracting attention, and with a cover story whose simplicity was perfect when looked at in retrospect. Her name, for the purposes of the operation, was Penelope, though she carried a British passport in another name. She was later identified by various sources as Erica Chambers, though the full details of her background and training remain as one would expect, classified or disputed. When she arrived in Beirut, she introduced herself as a volunteer aid worker. She was supposedly a kind-hearted young Englishwoman. At that time, Beirut had become a very chaotic country, and the presence of such people during a time like that was quite normal, so no one suspected her. The Lebanese Red Cross, various NGOs, foreign volunteer organizations. The city was full of people who had come to help, or to observe, or to document. One more was unremarkable. She rented an apartment. She established herself in a neighborhood. She became, to the people around her, a recognizable face. The quiet foreign woman, diligent, unassuming, going about her days. She had been given a specific objective: locate Salameh, map his patterns, identify the route or routes he used with enough regularity to constitute a predictable target. This was the foundational challenge of the entire operation. Salameh's security consciousness meant that no single route or timing could be assumed. She had to watch long enough to find the pattern within the apparent randomness. She watched for months. The intelligence she gathered, combined with information from other sources that the Mossad had been cultivating, eventually produced what the planners needed. A window. There was a stretch of road in the Snoobar neighborhood of West Beirut, near the intersection of Rue Verdun and Rue Madame Curie. For those hearing the names for the first time, they sounded like streets in Europe, but this place was the exact opposite. It was a place Salameh used frequently, and it had become the most suitable location to target him. For this purpose, a Volkswagen was rented. It was packed with approximately 100 kilograms of explosives, a quantity large enough to ensure destruction, but calculated to be deployed at a moment that would minimize additional casualties to the extent that such a calculation was possible in a dense, urban environment. On January 22, 1979, Ali Hassan Salameh left his apartment in the company of his bodyguards and got into one of his vehicles. The convoy moved through the streets of West Beirut. At some point during that movement, the precise mechanism of detonation has been described variously as remote-controlled, triggered by a tracking device, or activated by a Mossad operative with line of sight to the convoy. The Volkswagen exploded. Those who witnessed the explosion described how massive it was. Not only its sound, but also the impact it created was extremely powerful. People in many parts of the city heard it very clearly. Everyone ran in fear in different directions. With the explosion, it not only destroyed the vehicles around it, but almost made the entire surrounding area unrecognizable. Salameh's car and several others were obliterated. A number of bystanders were killed. The exact figure varies by source, with most estimates placing the civilian death toll at between 4 and 8 people, in addition to several of Salameh's bodyguards. The street, already marked by years of civil war damage, absorbed one more wound, and Ali Hassan Salameh, the Red Prince, the man who had survived a decade of pursuit, was dead at 35. As always, it took time for the exact truth to emerge. In such events, everything needed to settle before it became clear what had really happened. The first reports that came in had a high chance of being incomplete or incorrect, because there was massive destruction and a lot of information needed to be verified. And at that time in Beirut, reaching accurate information took much longer. But the people who needed to know the truth realized everything just hours later. After 6 years of failure, Mossad had finally achieved what it had been aiming for from the beginning. In this sense, Operation Wrath of God was now over. The reaction was not what a simple account of justice served might suggest. In Israel, there was no official acknowledgement. The Mossad does not typically acknowledge its operations, and this one was no exception. But the sense within the relevant communities was one of completion rather than celebration. The people who knew what Munich had meant, who had carried the weight of it for 7 years, experienced the news of Salameh's death with something more complicated than satisfaction. Relief, perhaps. The closing of a chapter that had been held open too long. Anger, had spread everywhere in Beirut and Palestine. Yasser Arafat was devastated by this news. Because Arafat had known Salameh since his childhood, he trusted him so much that he entrusted even his own security to him, without hesitation, and saw him like a son. His wife, Georgina Risk, was widowed at just 26 years old. They had only been married for 2 years, but there were rumors that she was pregnant. But the most painful part was that the grief and sorrow that affected the lives of those left behind were not talked about as much as the explosion itself. The explosion made the headlines, but the pain people carried in their hearts never truly faded. It is usually always like this. Robert Ames, the CIA officer who had maintained the back-channel relationship with Salameh, was reportedly deeply affected by the death. He had understood Salameh as a complex figure, not a villain in the flat sense of the word, but a man operating within a specific historical and political reality who had proven useful and whose loss now left a gap that would be difficult to fill. Ames continued his work in the region. He was killed in the 1983 Beirut embassy bombing, an attack carried out by Hezbollah with Iranian support, one of the deadliest single strikes against CIA personnel in the agency's history. The thread that connects these deaths, Salameh in 1979, Ames in 1983, runs through a period of Middle Eastern history so dense with consequence that it remains difficult to fully trace, even now. The Norwegian chapter of this story had a quieter ending. Sylvia Raphael and Abraham Gamer, the 2 Mossad operatives arrested after the Lillehammer killing, had served their sentences, been released, and eventually married. Sylvia Raphael left the intelligence world and spent the rest of her life in South Africa with her husband. Her only goal was to rest and live peacefully until the end of her life. However, in 2005, she learned that she had cancer. Shortly afterwards, she passed away. Her story was very different from the story of ordinary people. Her story was the story of an agent who fell in love while in prison in Norway for killing the wrong man. It was a very complex story, difficult to classify as simply good or bad. That is why, despite the years that have passed, it continued to attract people's attention. There is a film, there is a book, there is at the center of it a person who participated in an act of terrible injustice and who then lived out the rest of her life in something that, from the outside, looked very much like ordinary happiness. What that means, if it means anything, is not a question that has a clean answer. The broader question of what the Red Prince's death actually achieved is one that historians and intelligence analysts have been circling for decades without fully settling it. On one level, the answer seems obvious. A man held responsible for a devastating act of terrorism was found and killed after years of pursuit. The families of the Munich victims were, some of them, able to experience something they described as closure, though the word is always inadequate to the reality it is meant to describe. The Mossad demonstrated after the humiliation of Lillehammer that its long-term commitment to such objectives was real, that the passage of time did not diminish the intent, and that the resources and patience necessary to complete a complex operation across years and geographies were available to it. On another level, the death of Salameh did not end the conflict that produced him. The Palestinian cause did not end. The militant organizations were always there. They never went anywhere. On the contrary, the violence in Lebanon continued to increase with each passing year. In the following years, the 1982 Israeli invasion and the Sabra and Shatila massacre took place. These events were much bigger and more shocking than anything that had happened before. The world that Salameh had moved through, the world of Beirut in the 1970s, of Cold War proxy conflicts and regional nationalisms and intelligence services pursuing one another across borders with lethal patience, did not become more peaceful when he was removed from it. It became, if anything, more chaotic. This is the uncomfortable reality that tends to attach itself to targeted killing as a strategic instrument. It is emotionally coherent in a way that its strategic effects rarely are. The desire to hold specific individuals accountable for specific acts is deeply human. The belief that removing those individuals will alter the conditions that produce them is, historically, more difficult to sustain. The Red Prince died on a street in Beirut on a January morning, and the war, all of the overlapping, interlocking wars, continued without him. There is one more detail worth pausing on before this account closes. Erica Chambers, the woman who had lived among the people of West Beirut for months, who had become a familiar face in a neighborhood, who had built a false identity, careful enough to survive sustained proximity to her objective, disappeared after the operation. She was never publicly identified by the Mossad. She was never charged by any government. She returned to wherever she came from and, as far as the public record is concerned, ceased to exist. No one ever clearly learned who she really was. Her neighbors and the people who met her on the streets and greeted her never knew anything about her true identity. The area they lived in had been under the shadow of violence for years. Because of the explosions in the streets, no one was surprised anymore. There was now a familiar pain in people's souls. Despite everything, people continued to live, or at least tried to. Beirut, meanwhile, continued to be a part of the war. When Beirut was mentioned, war came to mind. And when war was mentioned, Beirut came to mind. What the story of Ali Hassan Salameh ultimately leaves behind is not a lesson exactly. History rarely delivers those in clean, usable form, but a series of images that resist easy interpretation. A man in a motorcade moving through streets he believed he knew, through a city that was destroying itself around him, with the confidence of someone who has survived too much to fully believe in his own mortality. There was a woman who quietly waited for the days to pass, watching from the window of her home, from a doorway, or from the table of a cafe where she sat. A vehicle filled with explosives was waiting for the right moment on a street with a European name in that city, which was once known as one of the most important and beautiful cities of the Middle East. The moment before detonation, when everything is still in its proper place, and then the moment after, when it is not. Ali Hassan Salameh was buried in Beirut. His grave exists. His son, who was an infant at the time of his death, grew up without a father. The questions asked about his life were never clearly answered. To what extent he was involved in the Munich incident, how much responsibility he actually had, how deep his relationship with the CIA was, and whether anything truly changed with his death. None of these were ever clearly revealed, and these truths will probably never be fully known. The archives that would settle them remain, for the most part, closed. What is certain is that he was real, that the people who died because of him were real, and that the people who died trying to kill him, or mistakenly killed in the attempt to find him, were real. The Red Prince is a story that exists at the intersection of politics and violence and personal life, which is to say, it exists at the intersection where most of the most important stories in history actually happen. Not in the grand declarations or the formal treaties, but in the ordinary texture of a life being lived, and then one morning in January, no longer being lived at all. Not in the grand declarations or the formal treaties, but in the ordinary texture of a life being lived, and then, one morning in January, no longer being lived at all. And yet, even that is not where the story truly ends. When a person dies, everything does not simply end. There are traces of him in the places he once lived, in the streets he walked, and in the cafes where he sat. His absence is still felt in unfinished conversations and in the lives that continue with his absence. In Beirut, the street where the explosion happened did not remain frozen in time. The debris was cleared. The shattered glass was swept away. The damaged buildings were repaired as much as war allowed them to be repaired. Traffic returned. People walked the same sidewalks again. Vendors opened their stalls. Children passed through on their way to places that still tried to function as schools. Someone who came there weeks later would not realize that something difficult to undo had happened. This is one of the quiet truths of violence. It leaves marks inside people, and those marks stay within them for a much longer time. There were people within the Mossad who had spent years thinking about Ali Hassan Salameh. For years, they had looked at his face, learned all his routines, and tried to understand the rhythm of his life. His death did not erase those years from their minds. It simply meant that the person they had focused on was no longer there. In intelligence work, you always have to look forward. There is always a new name. A different file is opened. A new file appears clipped to the corner of a folder. Even if there is a sense of completion in that moment, it does not last long. It is not allowed to last. Because in that world, there is no such thing as stopping and waiting. Some of the people who had participated in the operation would never speak about it at all. Others would speak carefully, years later, in fragments, not to explain, not to justify, but to acknowledge that it had happened. Because operations like this, despite their precision, exist in a strange space between visibility and invisibility. Everyone knows, and no one officially knows. In Lebanon, Salameh's absence created its own kind of vacuum. He was not just a target. He was also someone at the center of relationships that extended in many directions, within Fatah, in Lebanon, and beyond. His ability to move between different worlds and to speak with people who did not trust one another made him both important and dangerous. When he was killed, those connections did not transfer intact to someone else. The person who had held them together was no longer there, and as often happens, everything began to fall apart. The Civil War continued its slow and relentless progression. New militias rose, new alliances formed and dissolved. New names replaced old ones on lists that existed in offices far from the streets, where the consequences would eventually unfold. And in quieter spaces, life rearranged itself around loss. His son grew older in a world where his father existed only as stories and photographs. Stories told by people who remembered him as a symbol. Photographs that captured him in moments of stillness, smiling, standing, alive in a way that no longer corresponded to reality. This is another quiet aftermath of political violence. Children inheriting the unresolved meanings of events they did not witness. Georgina Risk lived the rest of her life with a memory that could never be erased. She remembered him not as a name in a file or a distant target, but as someone who had been beside her in the ordinary flow of life. The story people told from the outside was never the same as the truth she carried in her heart. Things like that are always different for the one who has lived them. And somewhere, in another country, the woman who had once been known as Penelope lived with the knowledge of what she had done. There is no public record of her reflection, no definitive account of what she thought in the years afterward. Intelligence services are designed, in part, to erase the individual from the action, to make the operation the only thing that remains visible. But she would have remembered the waiting, the long days of watching without acting, the discipline of becoming someone else convincingly enough that the world accepted the fiction. The moment when waiting ended and consequence began, and she would have understood, as anyone involved in such work eventually understands, that history rarely acknowledges the people who move within it quietly. It remembers the explosion. It remembers the name of the man who died. It rarely remembers the person who stood nearby and made it possible. Beirut itself continued to change. The war that defined the city in the 1970s would eventually end, though not quickly and not cleanly. The buildings would be rebuilt. The streets would fill again. The name Beirut would, slowly, begin to be associated with other things, with reconstruction, with resilience, with the uneasy persistence of life after prolonged destruction. But beneath those changes, the past remained. This story remained in archives that not everyone could access. At the same time, it continued to exist in the minds of the very few people who had truly lived it or felt it up close. There was something those who studied such events came to understand over time. The story of the Red Prince did not belong to just one man. It belonged to a time when countries did not let go of their enemies. Borders were sometimes nothing more than lines on a map. Intelligence services operated within a world that was known to exist, yet never officially acknowledged. In those days, the line between justice and revenge, between necessity and consequence, was never entirely clear. Over time, those lines blurred, and what remained was not clear answers, but a quiet and heavy truth. And it was about the individuals, all of them, who lived and died inside that moment. Ali Hassan Salameh lived for 35 years. He moved through one of the most dangerous cities in the world, with the confidence of someone who believed, at least in part, that he could continue doing so, indefinitely. For a long time, that belief appeared to be justified, until it wasn't. The motorcade moved forward. The street waited. The device remained silent until the exact moment it did not. And then, as it always does, history moved on. Not because it had reached a conclusion, but because history never does.